paper that has gone through history, and we have it today, that the Strategic Air Command reported on March 17, 1967, that, quote, all 10 missiles in Echo flight at Malmstrom Air Force Base lost strategic alert within 10 seconds of each other. That the fact that no apparent reason for the loss of 10 missiles can be readily identified is cause for grave concern to this SAC headquarters, close quote. 1 week later, on March 24, 1967, Air Force Captain Robert Salas was the launch control officer underground at Oscar flight at Malmstrom. Bob told me an above-ground security guard phoned him to say that a large red glowing UFO was hovering right over the Oscar launch control facility security gate. And suddenly, 10 missiles dropped off alert status, one every second. That's steam engine, steam engine, steam engine. That a missile is going down every second. And incredibly, he learned that the exact same thing had happened 1 week before on March 16, 1967, at Echo Flight that was also at Malmstrom. But he, being a captain and being a launch officer, knew nothing about the March 16th event. It was completely squashed, and then it happened to him. He put me in touch with a Boeing engineer who told me, quote, this is from my own notes in the 90s, talking with a Boeing engineer who was sent to Malmstrom and to investigate Oscar and Echo flights. Quote, Linda, it was impossible for those 10 missiles in 2 different flights to go offline one by one every second like they did. Impossible. But it happened. And the cause was apparently UFOs that we don't understand and we cannot control, close quote. Lou, there have been dozens of military eyewitnesses, such as Captain Salas, talking about UFO intrusions in our nuclear missile sites since the 1960s, maybe even the end of the 1950s. But the world has not fallen apart by those people speaking up. So why do you think that our government and other governments have classified almost everything about UFOs and ETs since World War II 70 years ago?
Well, in national security, there is perhaps one of the greatest fears that we could ever have in the world of national security is a vulnerability. And that is an Achilles heel, if you will, of our national security apparatus. And especially when you're talking about nuclear weapons. That is part of the nuclear triad, is really the crown jewels of our country. That is the one thing that, and some people argue, obviously it's a terrible technology. Other people argue it's the only thing that's been keeping the peace for this long because it's assured mutual destruction. Anytime there's a perceived vulnerability in our national security structure, in this case, our nuclear readiness, the government is going to be very, very, very loath to acknowledge that publicly because you're broadcasting to the enemy that, hey, look, if this can happen with UFOs, maybe Russia has the ability to do it as well, and we don't want to let Russia know that. So there is a huge concern to ever discuss any type of vulnerability we have. But you know what, Linda, you're absolutely right. And I know it for a fact because I've seen the intelligence reporting on the Maelstrom incident. But, equally concerning is that even some people may argue, well, they turned them offline. They're showing that, nuclear weapons aren't very, very useful for mankind. And yet in Russia, the exact opposite happened. In fact, there was an event where these nuclear weapons were actually brought online. So imagine how scary that is. Right. Now you have a potential runaway freight train and the start of World War III potentially. So, and then there's I'll share with you, I've never shared this publicly, and I want to be very careful not to go into too much detail, but there is allegedly, we're tracking this down, there was an incident involving a U.S. nuclear aircraft carrier in the early 70s, I won't say which one, that encountered a UFO and it brought the entire aircraft carrier offline for a while. And this was a nuclear powered aircraft carrier. So it's a big deal. And yes, you're right. We are seeing interference and interest, whatever interest it may be, by these UAPs around nuclear technologies. There's a book written by Robert Hastings. It's about the relationship the United States and the world has had with nuclear technology and the UAP phenomenon. It's very compelling. And by the way, it's very accurate. So you're right. There's a connection. We are aware of it in the national security arena. I think that's probably why Congress is taking this so seriously to some degree because of that connection.